Good afternoon. Welcome to the sort of first KNOMAD seminar of the year. And it is a true pleasure to welcome Jason Depal. I read somewhere that he's the ace New York Times reporter, and I have heard from many people that he's the foremost poverty writer in the U.S. on American poverty in America, poverty in the United States. And besides that, he had the misfortune or the courage to spend 3 days in a remote village, which is my village in India, with me. And he said that don't worry about the bad hotel. He can sleep in a yard with shed with goats in them too, if needed, which is what he has done in the past. Courage to him. And I said that, well, there might be snakes in there too. And he said, don't ever mention snakes because his wife doesn't like it. So it's really a pleasure to have him here. This is an event that I was hoping to organize about 3 to 4 months ago. When his book was launched in August, and I had the privilege of being in the room with him when this book, the one that is shown on the screen, A Good Provider is One Who Leaves, was launched. I had the privilege of being there with him, and I have followed his story about this book and about the people who are the family and personalities who are the protagonists of the book. I had the privilege of following them for a while now, for more than a decade now. And he has a lot to share on that, so I wouldn't talk about that. But I actually wrote a blog after that, and I think you would have copies of that, where I said good providers should not have to leave. They should have the option to leave, but they should not have to leave. And that's what we do in the World Bank, try to provide options. So I felt at that time, after reading the book, actually from cover to cover, that it was a milestone in the literature on migration and development, in the popular literature on migration and development. So I would strongly recommend that you read that book, because it provides a human story behind all the numbers that you see and all the jargons that you hear from us. A couple of words about KNOMAD, as I customarily do in KNOMAD seminars. KNOMAD 1.2 started in all earnest since September last year, and we have consolidated the number of themes to 9 themes. There is a new trust fund with a 5-year extension, and now there is a proposal which has been which seems to be moving within the World Bank management to make KNOMAD or expand it into an umbrella trust fund. It's a proposal at this stage. So that would mean actually more interesting work and more operational work on migration, and then we would begin to work towards giving people an option not to leave if they have to provide. So with that, let me welcome Jason, 2-time Pulitzer finalist. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip. Is this on? Is it working okay?
Could you tap on?
There it goes. Okay. Thank you. Dilip is the only source I've ever had who has shared both his friendship and his sister's chapatis. So thank you for all you've taught me. Thank you for taking me home. Thank you for inspiring me to write about migration. 30 years ago, I was a young reporter living in Manila with an interest in shanty towns, the scrapwood mazes that cover the city and much of the developing world. I called the city's most famous nun, who lived and worked in a shanty town called Leverisa. I didn't say so, but I was hoping she would help me move in. Sister Christine Tam was a friend of the new president, Cory Aquino, and working on a commission drafting a new constitution. "I'm busy," she snapped. "Call me back in a few months." Hoping for a quicker audience, I told her I'd been working with another nun in her order, and I discovered they weren't friends. "That's a mistake," she said. "Meet me tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock in front of the Manila Zoo." "Are you CIA?" she asked when I arrived. "Well, you wouldn't tell me if you were, would you?" She let me know that living with a Leverisa family wouldn't work. "The poor are magnificent people, unlike the rich," she said. "But most Americans need toilets, and homes in Leverisa lack them. A family would feel a need to buy me expensive food. I'd be a burden." Sister Christine talked on, denouncing the American military bases and American corporations. Then she waved her hand above her head and said, "Well, that's all up here," meaning politics. "Somehow we need to do more to build ties between the first and third worlds. If I returned in a few days, she'd see what she could do." So I came back a few days later thinking she'd use the time between our visits to find a family and see if they'd be willing to take in a boarder. Instead, she led me through the alleys and auctioned me off right on the spot. I knew just enough Tagalog to know the first woman she approached was horrified. So was the second. The third was simply struck mute. With her thin patience exhausted, Sister Christine stalked away. "If you don't want him, pass him on to somebody else," she said, "and don't cook him anything special. If he gets sick, too bad." I don't know who was more frightened, Tita or me. We drew a crowd. "Ask him if he eats rice. Ask him if he wants to marry a Filipina." Tita stalled for as long as she could, then gave in to what she took to be Sister Christine's request and offered me a spot on her floor. I was interested in slum life, not migration. But migration was how the family survived. Tita's husband, Emmett, was 5,000 miles away, cleaning pools in Saudi Arabia, while Tita was home raising their 5 children on the money he sent back. What started as an act of desperation became a way of life. All 5 of those kids grew up to become overseas workers too, and they're part of a big extended family spread out across the globe. So just about everything that could happen to a migrant family, good or bad, had happened to somebody in the clan. The book takes its name from Tita's sister, Peachy, who is living in a straw hut and watching her siblings go abroad and come back and build cement block homes. She got jealous and turned to her husband and said he needed to go abroad and do the same thing, and offered a phrase that could serve as the family motto: "A good provider is one who leaves," she told him, telling him he too needed to go to Saudi Arabia. The member of the family I came to know best was Tita's daughter, Rosalie. She used her father's remittances to make the leap from the slums to nursing school, and then spent nearly 2 decades in the Persian Gulf, mostly Abu Dhabi, all the while hoping to get to the States. She was about to give up when a hurricane slammed into Galveston, Texas, with sort of Katrina-like consequences. A sixth of the island never came back. Unable to lure enough nurses back to the island, the local hospital tried for several years, offered $5,000 bonuses. It finally gave up and took what it thought to be a risk by hiring 20 nurses from abroad to come together and open a new ward. Rosalie finally had her chance. She arrived in the summer of 2012. Her husband and Chris and their 3 young children soon followed. Their period of adjustment coincided with the rise of Donald Trump and a surge of conservative populism that regards assimilation as a failure and immigrants as a threat to jobs, culture, safety, fiscal health, and national security. The Villanueva story often offers a retort. With a house in the suburbs and kids on the honor roll, they achieved in 3 years a degree of assimilation that used to take 3 generations. And they did it, moreover, in Metro Houston, a hub of red state, a hub of pro-immigrant sentiment deep in red state America, which I came to think of as a hint, perhaps, that migration is less divisive as it's lived out at the daily level than it is in national politics. If all you knew about national politics, you'd think we were a country just endlessly divided by immigration. But Houston, you get a very different sense of that. In a country of 44 million immigrants, no one family can stand for the whole. The Villanuevas, as I came to think of them, really stands for the part missing from the Trump Twitter feed. And it also happens to be the greatest anti-poverty success story I know. So I'm going to tell you the story. It begins in the 1950s when a young boy on a distant island smuggled aboard a crowded ferry and brought on an overnight trip to Manila. This is Rosalie's father, Emmett, who was recently orphaned, and a distant relative had come to the province to take him back home to live with her. Home was Leverisa, a squalid mudflat ruled by warring gangs, where sanitation consisted of, quote, flying saucers, bundles of waste wrapped in newspaper and flung into the surrounding canals. Leverisa looked grim, but Emmett liked the tumult of city life. He liked the garish jeepneys, the babble of dialects, the men throwing dice in the alley. He wore his geniality as a shield and was quick to make friends. Drawn to commerce more than to school, he spent his youth in traffic, hawking newspapers and cigarettes, and then in his early 20s, he landed his first real job, cleaning a nearby government pool. He's walking home with his first paycheck when he spies a beautiful young woman in the alley, ironing clothes, the love story part of the story. Tita had no interest. She considered Emmett plain-looking and, quote, poorer than a rat. But his persistence carried the day. They married in 1967, and 5 children followed in alliterative step. This will only make sense to you if you're Filipino. Their names are Rolando, Rowena, Rosalie, Roldan, and Rosalier. Rowena, Rosalie's older sister, was born with a heart defect that left her perpetually weak and in need of medicine that Emmett couldn't afford. After years of fretting over her frail health, he dropped to his knees and asked God to make a decision: take her or let him have her. God answered in a mysterious way. Soon after, Emmett got an offer to work in Saudi Arabia. He'd be away from his family for 2 years in an Islamic autocracy where stories of abused workers are rife, but he'd earn 10 times his Manila pay. He accepted on the spot. It took him a week to get up the courage to go tell Tita. By the time I arrived 7 years later, Emmett was on his 3rd contract in Saudi Arabia. Rowena had her medicine, and the house was one of the few in Leverisa with a toilet, which I came to understand was why Sister Christine had steered me there. So I'd found my place among the poor. I was excited and honored, but I wasn't sure what to do with them, and they weren't sure what to do with me. Language gaps and excessive politeness kept me and Tita strangers for a few days, until she solicited my help with a gluing project, turning newspapers into paper bags. And I botched it so badly, she threatened to mark them Made in USA. With that, I knew I'd made a friend. Half of Tita's life revolved around drudgery. I'd be on my floor mat, at 5 o'clock in the morning, listening to her boil the breakfast rice. I'd be back there at midnight, listening to her wrestle the laundry. But the other half revolved around slum solidarity. She was part of Sister Christine's slum uplift group, deeply involved in a program of Bible studies and livelihood projects, sort of meant to answer the question, what would Jesus do if Jesus were a squatter? Tita was the manager of the co-op store and responsible for distributing 2,000 eggs a week, which she stacked under a fluorescent light in the kitchen to keep away the rats. I came to think of the eggs as like a metaphor for the fragility of Filipino democracy and the fragility of Tita's existence. To give Tita a break one day, I took her to see a Tagalog movie. And we're sitting in the movie theater, and then she startles and slaps her head, kind of like out of a cartoon, slapstick. And I thought I had missed a Tagalog plot twist or something, and she had forgotten to write down an egg sale, on her little cards. It's just her whole mind was constantly on these 2,000 eggs that she had to bring into the slum and make sure it got distributed and keep an accounting for. Between all these chores, Tita told me she'd been asking God a question. Why, if you love your son, are so many Filipinos poor? It's like the central theodicy. It's the central question of faith. Why does God, being omnipotent, allow suffering? And it's particularly relevant in a place that suffers as much as Leverisa. But it wasn't a question I expected a woman with a 6th grade education and such a besieged life to be so readily able to articulate. I asked her what God had answered, and she laughed at herself, mocking her presumptuous request for God to fortify her faith. She said, "Not yet. I'm not sure what I expected to find in Manila, but it wasn't a woman in a worn house coat trying to live out the gospel beneath this tower of eggs." Rosalie was Tita's main helper, a shy, dutiful girl who always got cast as a nun in the youth group plays. If you were going to pick a kid in the slums who had the drive to get out, you probably wouldn't have picked Rosalie. There were other kids who had bigger personalities, who were more outgoing, who better in school. The B's and C's that Rosalie carried into high school, showed no special academic promise. But what I came to realize years later when I found her high school transcript, that the most revealing part of it wasn't her grades, it was her attendance. Through 4 years of desperate poverty and literal revolution in the Philippines, Rosalie never missed a day. She said, about high school is where I got grit, she said, looking back on it. The surest way for a Filipino woman to advance is to become a nurse. The U.S. had established the country's first nursing schools during the colonial occupation. Filipinos trained in English on an American curriculum. Over the decades, thousands had migrated to the U.S., so there was a migrant network. Nursing school was a leap for a girl from the slums, both academically and financially. Rosalie made it, but just barely. You had to keep an 80 average after 2 years, or the school made you leave. I think it's because they're trying to keep up their board passing rates. So 2 years into this, as Emmett's sending back all the money he possibly can, they're really sacrificing for Rosalie to go through nursing school. She gets a 79.5, and indelicately they actually list this on the outside the dean's office. You know, all the people who are being asked to leave. So Rosalie joins this group of crying nursing students filing out of the school to go apply somewhere else, and somehow at the last minute the dean decides to round it up and give her an 8. So salvation by upward rounding. Rosalie made it. And, through her story, I won't go into all the examples, but there are a half dozen times where she encounters a similar, near-death experience on some test or another, or some credentialing exercise on her path to the Philippines. I mean, on her path to the United States. So she's always just barely making it. She gets her nursing degree. Uncle comes home from Saudi Arabia, says a hospital outside Mecca is hiring. She moves there on her second contract in Saudi. She met her husband, another Filipino guy working in a factory. They had to court secretly to avoid the religious police. They came home married in the Philippines. Family logistics gets a little complicated here. They have a daughter in the Philippines. They moved to Abu Dhabi. They have 2 more children. They send the kids back to Tita and Emmett, who are now living on a farm outside of Manila. And this is supposed to be, they're separated from their children, 3 young children, for what was supposed to be a year or so, and it went on for 8 years. So the kids are with Tita and Emmett on the farm. Rosalie and Chris are in Abu Dhabi. They're all waiting to get to the U.S. Then finally a hurricane hits Galveston. Rosalie gets her chance. So Rosalie and I kept in touch throughout all this time, but we didn't see each other for nearly 2 decades. And then I went back to write a story inspired by the World Bank's remittance expert. I went back to write a story about the family and the rise of migration. And the light bulb moment for me in understanding the importance of migration was learning that remittances, the sums that migrants, I'll have to tell you this, right? The sums that migrants send home are 3 times the world's foreign aid budgets combined. That was, I don't think a statistic in my career has ever struck me as powerfully as that migration is the world's anti-poverty program. If you think that so many people often say, the poor should do more for themselves, well, migrants do. I'd known that migration was such a big deal in Rosalie's life and in the family's life, but I hadn't glimpsed its global implications until I read that. No country does more to promote migration than the Philippines, where the government trains and markets overseas workers. Presidents celebrate them as heroes. I was talking to someone before today before the event. I had an encounter once with Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, the president of the Philippines, who did an annual welcome back for the Filipino workers coming home from Christmas. They literally roll out a red carpet that's like half a mile long down the corridor in the Manila airport. And she stands there with cookies and welcomes them home. So we get in an elevator on the way to the event, and I had time to ask her one question. So I asked, why do you call the Filipino workers heroes? She's about this tall, and she looked up at me and like I was just a dunce, and she said, because they send home $1 billion a month. Got it. All right. Migration is to the Philippines what cars once were to Detroit, the civil religion. When the paper sent me there, they wanted me to write about the effect of migration on Philippine culture, and I thought, God, this might be a little too subtle for an outsider. I don't really speak Tagalog. I don't live in the Philippines. How am I going to, as an outsider to the culture, grasp this subtle question? And then I drove by the Philippine Central Bank that had the year's remittance tally strung up in Christmas lights 8 stories high. So it wasn't so subtle. Even the New York Times reporter could grasp it. 250 million migrants have spread out across the globe. They support a population back home as big, if not bigger. What struck me as I started to learn about migration wasn't just its size, though, was its ubiquity. That Ireland had its first African-born mayor. Mongolians were doing scut work in Prague. 19th century migration was largely a transatlantic affair, but migration now is just everywhere. The story differs in every country, but the underlying dynamics are pretty similar. Rich aging countries need workers, and poor countries need jobs. Cheap travel speeds the migrant way, and instant communication spreads word that opportunity awaits. You definitely see that in the extended family. They're all in a Facebook group, so whenever anybody lands somewhere, the opportunity, news of opportunity goes back just immediately. Captured by the sweep of the story, inspired by Dilip Ratha, I decided to turn the magazine story into a book built around Rosalie and her family. But in narrative terms, I had a real challenge because it was a story about Filipinos in Abu Dhabi and was pretty peripheral to American interests. I debated it for a year or two, and thought, how am I going to make this seem relevant to the United States? I couldn't figure out a way, and I finally said, well, I'm not going to. I'm just going to write the story for what it is. It's of interest to me. Okay. And then the narrative gods smiled. A month after I signed the book contract, Rosalie got the job in Texas. So I had my American connection. My commute was shortened. I met her in Manila, and we traveled to Galveston, where things got off to a surprisingly rocky start. Rosalie had wanted to come to the United States for 20 years, but she really didn't know much about it. She had it kind of up on a pedestal, she came expecting Disney World, and she wound up in a declining blue-collar Gulf Coast town with a vista of vacant lots. The cost of living was higher than she expected. American English was hard to understand. When we got to Galveston, somebody suggested we go grab lunch at a little hole in the wall down the street, and Rosalie turned to me, looking very alarmed, and said, "Kuya, how are we going to eat in the hole in the wall?" The hole in the wall served poor boys. Rosalie wanted to know why it didn't serve poor girls. World travelers aren't always worldly. Rosalie had worked abroad for nearly 2 decades, but always in a cocoon of Filipinos. Homesick, she got retreated into a cocoon of the familiar. There's 7,641 islands in the Philippines. I started thinking of her apartment as the 7,642nd, which had purple yam in the refrigerator and Tagalog soaps on the TV, and she'd keep a Skype connection on for 12 or 13 hours a day just to listen to the roosters crowing 13 time zones away. The first place Rosalie felt comfortable was in the hospital, not because the work there was easy, but because she felt equal to its difficulties. I think work for her became the first vehicle of assimilation, and there's probably a bigger point there. I'm not in any way an expert on European immigration, but from what I understand, integration usually proceeds more rapidly in the United States. I think one reason might be that the way our economy is structured, there are more entry-level jobs, and it gets people out into the society more. One thing to emphasize about Rosalie's work is that she didn't take an American job. The hospital had tried for years to bring Americans onto the island. It was paying $5,000 bonuses, and it just couldn't get American nurses to stay. So she filled a job the hospital had been trying to fill and improve the community's health care. Another thing to note is that Rosalie's a really good nurse. I had intuited that, but it was wonderful to actually be able to see it. The hospital was extremely generous. They gave me a pair of scrubs and permission just to follow her as I wished. My wife is a health policy official, and she said I was a walking HIPAA violation. But the most telling testimonial about Rosalie's nursing care didn't come in the hospital. It came in the produce aisle of a Walmart where we were out grocery shopping. This woman comes flying up, grabs Rosalie and says, "Remember me?" And Rosalie's blank look, you can tell she doesn't. The woman says, "GI bleed, bad GI bleed." And Rosalie brightens and nods and says, "Yeah, room 13. It had been 6 months. She remembered exactly what room the woman had been when she described her condition. The woman had no idea who I was, of course, but she just turned to me and gushed. She said, "You can just really tell she loves what she's doing. She loves to take care of people. It wasn't like this is just my job. She wasn't doing it for the money." And I heard some version of that over and over again. One patient in the hospital told me that she recalled waking up from surgery and seeing Rosalie's face. "I just remember thinking she's got the kindest eyes," she said. Another woman said, it's just like she feels your pain." Given all the talk of immigrants taking jobs, I made a point of asking if any of her patients resented her for that in private when Rosalie wasn't there. Not one told me she did. They noticed her care, not her ethnicity. If anyone was going to resent her, I thought it might be this woman I met one night, 80-year-old African-American woman who told me a story that was like out of Zora Neale Hurston. She'd grown up as a sharecropper. She'd plowed behind mules. She had chopped cotton. She'd been beaten by her first husband. She'd been beaten by her second husband. She'd always wanted to become a nurse, and she'd never gotten above low-paid work as a nursing aide. So I said, how do you feel about these other women coming in from the Philippines and taking those kinds of jobs? Though she was black and Rosalie was Filipino, she said she considered them part of the same clan, like the tribe of low-born strivers. She said, "I admire anybody and anybody that's trying to get up above where they came from. Don't stop, keep going." This is a nice moment of ethnic solidarity. 6 months after Rosalie arrived, the family follows. So Rosalie's alone, homesick, terrible mood for, at one point gets so depressed she wants to go back home. She lasts till the kids and her husband finally come. Christine was 9, Laura was 7, Dominique was 6. After all this time of living apart, they weren't just having to learn to live together in a new country. They had to learn to live together, period. They were, in some ways, strangers to each other. The kids assimilated rapidly, but in surprising and contrasting ways. Christine, the eldest, adopted the popularity-seeking ways of middle school girls. Her vision of, many of you watch The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, her vision of an American was London Tipton, kind of the shopping, ditzy rich girl on the cruise ship. She took selfies by the thousands, posted them on Instagram accounts with names like Christine Cute and Swelfie Queen, and her teachers groaned and said, affectionately, "She's Americanizing." Laura was Americanizing too, the younger sister, but with a special gift for combining her Filipino and American selves. I tell the story of Laura's assimilation or integration into American life through a story about Rosa Parks. When Laura, she first gets to the U.S., she's 7. She's in 2nd grade. It's Black History Month, and her teacher tells her that Rosa Parks is a hero. And the idea of a hero in handcuffs makes no sense to a girl, 7-year-old girl straight from the Philippines, where children are told to honor their elders, obey authority. She didn't listen to the policeman, Laura says. She couldn't be a hero. And besides, everybody knows heroes wear capes. A year later, Laura's sitting around after dinner, and she announces, apropos of nothing, "I sort of agree with Rosa Parks. She paid her money like everybody else, so it wasn't fair for her to have to sit somewhere different. But what she really admired wasn't just Parks's principles, it was also her politeness. When the policeman arrested her, she didn't say any bad words," Laura said. So for an immigrant girl deftly blending cultures, Rosa Parks became like, quote, the civil rights hero who didn't curse. The point about blending cultural strengths obviously goes beyond Laura. 4 sociologists led by Phil Kasnitz and Mary Waters studied 3,400 kids in New York City, and they found that the children of immigrants, on average, did better than the children of natives, even though they came from families with less money and education. So how could that be? they came up with a theory. They called it second generation advantage. So two parts of it will be very familiar to you. One is that immigrants are self-selected for ambition, and they pass that on to their kids somehow. So Christine and Laura were heirs to that. Another is that they benefit from tight, dense networks that offer them guidance on where to find jobs and living in ways that natives don't. But the third fact, the other side of the third factor, which I think is less familiar, just that they benefited from living at a cultural crossroads. And one way that this became vivid to me was to think about the great creativity in, say, mid-century New York City when the children of the Ellis Island immigrants were coming of age. It took a Russian-born Jew, Irving Berlin, to write I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas and God Bless America. You know, that there's something about the mix of being at a cultural crossroads that was empowering and creative to them. So I came to think of Laura as second generation personified, right? Her Filipino traits included her manners, her faith, her close family bonds. But from America, she got a reduced sense of class and gender constraints. And above all, she got a license to ask questions. Nothing in Philippine culture had encouraged Laura to probe. On the contrary, Filipino children were taught to obey their elders, not to interrogate them. And she had a classroom with 70 kids, so there just simply wasn't time to raise your hand and ask questions. But American teachers loved questions, and so Laura obliges. Do fish sleep, she asks. Is the Leaning Tower of Pisa ever going to fall? Is Galveston an empire? Do nurses have to be caring? Maybe I'll just be a doctor. She'd come home and ask Rosalie all these questions, you know, and Rosalie would be half asleep from having worked all night. And she'd turn to her and say, Laura, look it up on the Google. Curious how she'd grown curious, Laura formed her own assimilation theory. She said she was new to the country, afraid of having to repeat second grade, so I told myself I better get interested right now, and being interested became a habit. Or put differently, life at the cultural crossroads had encouraged new ways of thinking, just as the New York sociologist had said. One day we stopped for an after-school snack, and Laura sprang a sneaky question on me. She said, do you know how to infer? No 8-year-old had ever asked me that. I frowned as if trying to remember. I'm going to teach you, she said. She paused to dip her French fry in her Oreo McFlurry and increase the suspense. My editors wrote back in the margins, that's the grossest line I've gotten in a manuscript all year. It's like when you say it's cold, it's really snowy outside. I didn't tell you what season it was, but you can infer it's winter. And then she marked the triumph by stabbing the air with a milky fry and said, you see, it works. After 2 years in the States, the 4 nurses finished their contracts and got hired as permanent staff. Pay raises, permanent status ignited a real estate boom. 6 of the Filipinos bought houses in the same subdivision, and 3, including Rosalie, share a cul-de-sac, the Filipino cul-de-sac, Texas City. After 3 years in the United States, that badge of belonging, a house in the suburbs, was hers. And a month later, Donald Trump launched his presidential campaign with an attack on immigrants, whom he called criminals, welfare cheats, and a threat to, quote, jobs, wages, housing, schools, tax bills, and general living conditions. He offered his cheering crowds a parable about immigrant treachery he called the snake. It's the tale of a kind woman who takes in a stranger and is repaid with a venomous bite. Rosalie wasn't a snake, she was a nurse. In standard cost-benefit terms, her move was a triple win. It was good for her, it was good for her patients, it was good for the family she supports in the Philippines. But cost-benefit analysis alone doesn't do her story justice. Rosalie's escape from Levarisa is a minor miracle. Migration was her vehicle of salvation. It respected her talent, rewarded her sweat, and enlarged her capacity for giving. It made her life deeper, fuller, and more filled with hope. That her quest ended in Texas is something for Americans to cheer. It's good for your country to be the place people go to make dreams come true. I asked Rosalie how the new house compared to the hovel where we met, with the leaks, rat, crowds, and stench. Oh my God, she told the kids, big difference. Mommy grew up in a shanty. Christine looked up from her Instagram account. What's a shanty, Mommy? She said. Thank you. I think we have some slides, if they work. There we go. So this is still different giving this talk to a group of people at the World Bank. I don't have to tell you what a shanty town is, but I gave a talk at a church group over the weekend, so that was less familiar to them than it is to you. That's Sister Christine at Moloch and Young Palace. She used to take the kids from Leverisa, from the shantytown, to see Imelda's. They had Imelda's 1,000 Shoes on display at Moloch and Young Palace, and she used to lecture them about the virtues of simple living. Sister Christine's from a very wealthy family, educated in the United States, and she had taken her vow of poverty and gone off to live in the slums. She would lecture the slum girls on how good it was to only have one pair of shoes. And she was trying to get Rosalie to become a nun. And Rosalie said, well, she didn't need 1,000 pair like Imelda, but she wouldn't mind a dozen and a new handbag. So she, having come by her poverty more honestly, or naturally anyway, she didn't find it as seductive as Sister Christine did. I love that picture of them on Emmett poorer than a rat. He looked pretty good there. This is right before Emmett first went to Saudi Arabia. They had 5 kids, so I think Tita was either pregnant or soon after with her youngest. That's Rosalie second from the left. That's Rowena, her sister, with one with a heart condition. 10 times his salary for doing exactly the same work. Would you let that guy move in if he showed up on your shanty? Hi, I'm here from the United States. I'm interested in slum life. Tita and the eggs. So that's the. I did a piece for the Times Magazine that got me going on this. That was Rosalie was still in Abu Dhabi at that point. She's supposed to be looking off longingly for the United States. That's Christine on the left, Dominique, so for the Filipinos among us, there would be Tintin, Boy Boy, and Lara. So Christine on the left, Dominique, and Lara. Lara's full name is Precious Lara. Aptly named. We took a trip to New York, not actually to go to the Statue of Liberty, but because Chris had a relative, a Filipino, who was having a debut party for her. When Filipinos at their 18th, there's a big birthday, and they have like these kind of debutante parties, so it was a big deal, and we went up for that. And worked in a trip to Liberty Island, but mistimed it because Chris was running to catch a plane, and so we had to get the one ferry over and then like get the next ferry back. So we had 10 minutes or something on the island, and I think of that as like we wound up posed under the Statue of Liberty's armpit. So somehow it's not the ideal Statue of Liberty picture, but it kind of captures the chaotic feel of the moment. Christine, the selfie queen, practicing. I have a videotape of her about 10 minutes long of her describing her various techniques. Lara was known as the slowest eater in the family. She would linger and pick at her rice, and if you wanted to know what was going on with Lara, you would hang out there, and you could hear about Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks and her various heroes. That's the house on the Filipino cul-de-sac. Sometimes I feel like I didn't have to spend all the time writing the book. I could have just reduced it to the before and after, and you get the picture, right? The book came out in August. So, of course, there's a long... You have to go write the book, so the kids keep growing up. So now, this year, Christine's in a junior in high school, Lara's a freshman, Dominique is in 7th grade, I guess. And Rosalie and Chris. Have any of you been to Bad Saint, the restaurant here? It's like impossible. There's 3 tables, impossible to get in. Filipino restaurant. So my wife, when she said, "Oh, we have to take them to Bad Saint," when they came up for a bookstore event when the book first came out, and I said, "Well, we'll never get in," and she said, "Well, let me give it a try," and she wrote them and told them their whole story and sent them the book, and they gave them a special seating at Bad Saint. And that is Rosalie and Chris yesterday taking the oath of citizenship in Houston. I was went down with, yesterday and got to watch them be sworn in. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jason. I must say, this must be the only seminar where I haven't seen people pulling out their iPhones. I really mean, I was looking at, I was looking at that more, but thank you very much. I think this is what we really need in the World Bank, to put the human face, the stories, the story of, well, the story behind all the hard numbers that we see or we don't see. Let's have a few questions. We have about half an hour. And is that okay?
Of course.
Yeah. If any of you have questions, and I know that we have a few colleagues on WebEx. Maybe they should be the first one to speak up if any of you have questions. Otherwise, do shout, because we won't be able to hear you otherwise. So please raise your hands, and so we have a couple of questions. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's such a compelling story, but sometimes when we're in these countries, I lived in the Philippines for a number of years, and in other countries where there's a lot of remittances, there's kind of a some people really resent it, that maybe this is kind of along the same lines that you hear in the United States about why we shouldn't have welfare because it makes people indolent, or there can be kind of a moralistic kind of feeling that maybe this is a failure. And I was wondering if, obviously, you're showing the great success story, but I was wondering if in all of your years of reporting, you've seen that and what your reaction to that is.
Where I've seen it is the kids who are, is that what you're talking about? Kids who are reliant on their parents? One of the kind of stock figures in Philippine popular culture is the ne'er-do-well kid who's living off the sacrificing overseas worker. So, interestingly, I was in Houston yesterday with the family, and Rosalie was complaining at length about two of her nephews who she's sending to college and who aren't really going to college, and so that's the place where I've seen fear of remittance dependency. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Roberta Romano from the International Organization for Migration, IOM. So first of all, thank you so much for this great storytelling and this piece of amazing journalism. And what is more amazing than the story of Rosalie is that there are a million other stories like this, and they're so powerful. So I have two questions. One is about, you mentioned some migration policies that were affecting the situation as you were describing it. Do you believe that stories like this and books like this can actually have an effect on policy making, maybe through public opinion influence, or the two things will remain separate? And the second would be interesting, maybe in a follow-up to this story, to understand whether the story of Rosalie and Chris is actually affecting positively also lives of families that are left in the Philippines through the remittances, but through other exchange of human capital and other type of influence, both financial and non-financial, to understand the spillover of this success also in the Philippines. Thank you.
Well, on the second question, I'm probably one of the least credentialed people in the room to answer the impact of migration on development. But what I guess what I'd say about the Philippines is it's been effective as an anti-poverty strategy and a human capital development strategy, but not as a particularly accelerated economic growth. So Rosalie, Rosalie's mom, had a 6th grade education, but she's one of 11. By the time you get to the bottom of those 11, one of her younger sisters, actually has a PhD that she earned because her daughter became an overseas. I mean, when Peachy was going through college, she got through college. Tita had a 6th grade education. By the time she got to Peachy, she could afford to get through college. But then she sent her daughter overseas as a cruise ship maid, and she went back. Her daughter sent her back to graduate school. So you see this incredible investment in human capital. I mean, they all started with grade school educations, and most of them now in this big extended family. So Tita was one of 11. 9 of that group went abroad. Now there's a cousin's generation of like 45. So among that sort of generation, I think a college degree is now the standard. So you definitely see in this family the expansion of human capital. What you don't see is much opportunity to use that at home, as opposed to, they've become middle class, but they have to do it by working abroad. Your first question was whether I hope that narratives change the world. Hope, yes. Expect would be much more modest. I think if I'm honest with myself, I think I wrote it more because I was in love with the story than because I had a realistic expectation that it would change the world. I think all journalists hope their work will have a public impact. It's why you do it, but there's a lot going on in migration that forces that I'm afraid are probably bigger than a narrative. I was just so what really got me out of bed to do it every day was how impressed I was with Rosalie's and Tita's perseverance and faith and devotion to each other, generosity to each other. I mean, just well beyond the norms of anything in an American family. Like Rosalie would take in relatives for 2 years at a time. Yeah, in our family, if my brother-in-law comes for more than a weekend, it's this is. I was inspired and humbled by their story and wanted to tell it. Of course, I hope something beneficial comes from it, but the real energy of it probably came more from that.
Any other?
My name is Nadej from the KNOMAD team. Thank you very much for the story you presented. This is very compelling. I have a question related to the fact that you are from the journalism field, and we often see in the news that most of the news on migration are negative, and your book comes with a positive view on migration. So I was wondering, how can you help change the narrative in the journalism field using your book, or I don't know, whatever you can do? And should we now push for more migration, as the recent Nobel Prize have recommended? So because the story shows clearly that migration is good for both sides. So should we continue pushing for
thank you for that question. It's a frustration I have that journalism right now is so focused on the border crisis, and I understand why it is, and I wouldn't for a minute say we shouldn't cover that. Of course, it's an extremely compelling, important stories of humanitarian crisis, but I fear that it's overshadowed the much larger story of legal immigration, which is also and often a very successful story, like Rosalie's. So again, I don't really have to tell you all this, but for the last 10 years, there's been among new immigrants, Asians have outnumbered Latinos. Most of the people, about half of the people have college degrees. More than half live in the suburbs. So Rosalie is as much no one immigrant can stand for everybody, but Rosalie is as much the face, I think, of American immigration now as the border crisis is, and you certainly don't see that reflected in the political discussion or in journalistic coverage. So I think that gives Americans a skewed sense of what share of people come undocumented, and it gives people a skewed sense of who immigrants are and what they're doing.
Any questions from colleagues participating virtually? You are here.
Sorry. Thank you. Sonia Plaza, also from the KNOMAD team. I have a question, because the story of Rosalie is very compelling from the woman's side, from the gender side, on how maybe you can explain a little bit how she was behaving when she was in Saudi Arabia, and how her way to approach also has changed from the religious experience and from the gender experience. Will be interesting to hear their view.
The book became much more about gender than I had expected. So 20 nurses moved to Galveston. 19 of them are women, and most are have trailing spouses. And the men are by and large experiencing downward mobility, both in terms of economically and in status. Some of them had good jobs overseas, and they were following their wives to Texas. And in the broader context, of course, migration is feminizing. So if you go back 30 years ago, in theory, the feminization of migration was seen among feminists as an opportunity. The women would have their own source of income. They'd be less reliant on the men. Break the stranglehold of patriarchy. It would be a story of women's empowerment and uplift. And it proved to be much more complicated as it was in Rosalie's life because, and this is true, I think, not just among Rosalie, among Filipinos, but you see this if you read ethnographies. It came up in ethnographies I was read as different as Indian nurses in the Midwest, Salvadorans in San Francisco, Vietnamese in Philadelphia, different ethnic groups, different classes, different times, but a real struggle with the men feeling usurped because the women tend to adapt and get jobs more easily. So among the Filipinos, one guy just came up to me and like unprompted and told me he'd been having an affair on his wife just to show her that he wasn't, she may make more money than him, but he's not intimidated by her. Another guy took the opposite approach and said, she's the boss, I'm just the man wife, I stay home and do that. But I kind of advertised his emasculation. Another guy got obsessively jealous and followed his wife around and actually got to the point of inspecting her undergarments for signs of an affair. I went to, I'm not asking about this, right? People are just telling me. I meet one of the husbands. This guy was Jamaican, and we agreed to have a cup of coffee. I showed up for a cup of coffee. We meet at McDonald's, and he's brought, I haven't said a word about gender or masculinity. We just met at a Christmas party. He shows up with a sheaf of newspaper clippings from his college soccer career to show me what a great soccer player he was. He had an MBA. He had worked in Jamaica in business, and now he was a stock clerk at a Walmart or a Walgreens. And the way I interpreted that was he felt so diminished that he felt a need to sort of assert. And it played out in a big way with Rosalie and Chris. Chris has got his assurance of his masculinity by going to cockfighting farms. He started raising fighting cocks. He didn't fight them, which is illegal in Texas, but he shipped them back to the Philippines. And Rosalie said he's crazy. He's crazy for chickens. My husband's a chicken crazy. Well, I was there, 2 days ago. Chris has on the cul-de-sac. He's got a big chicken coop he's bought now. He's raising roosters in the backyard of the subdivision. Here's how Rosalie handled the gender conflict in her family. She took out the mortgage in her name only and put both their names on the deed so that Chris would not feel usurped. And the women they want the men to feel good and to function because they need them for their families. They want their kids to have functioning, strong fathers. They want their marriages to, Rosie's a very traditional woman. She doesn't really want to overshadow her husband. So everybody's doing a really complicated dance around that in a way that wasn't on my radar at all before I showed up.
Thank you very much for this compelling story, very captivating. My name is Stuart Ikonga from the East Asia and Pacific region of the bank. 2 questions. One, where does the drive or factor come from in terms of the perception by not just in the US but in Europe that immigrants are the ones who are causing problems or the ones who are committing crimes? Where does it come from? Is it ignorance? Is it denial? Is it just resentment, racism? Where does it come from? If you can speak to that in terms of some of the things you mentioned earlier. The second one is from the US policy perspective, they look at remittances as could be potentially a vehicle for terrorists to send money, and yet from this story it shows that most of the remittances are meant to help, to educate, to support the families. Can you speak to any of these two issues? Thank you.
I'm not sure I can in any intelligent way about where the fear of foreigners come from, but other than to say I think it's pretty deep-seated and universal. I mean, both across cultures and across time. It's certainly, it's not new in the United States, and it's not confined to the United States. In a way, I think it's almost more surprising. The acceptance is more surprising, and I feel like I'm juggling two narratives at the national level. The story's, like I said, all about conflict, but if you go to Houston is ranked as the most ethnically diverse metro area in the country, more than LA and New York, but somebody had a formula. When I was growing up, Houston was honky-tonks and rodeos. It was monocultural, it was like cowboys. And now there are Hindu temples in the suburbs, and there's a big Muslim population, and they celebrate Viet Cajun cuisine, and it's, really a pro-immigrant place. So if you go back to 1965, when the immigration laws changed, and if I could, I was 5 years old, so I don't know what I would have thought, but the expectations of what kind of conflict, that much ethnic change, I would have guessed, I think, a lot more than there's been in Houston. I think probably the fact that immigration grew up alongside the civil rights movement and structure helped the United States, helped there be less conflict. So I think understanding our particular moment right now requires you to kind of juggle two thoughts. Why is there so much conflict here in Washington, and why isn't there more there? Or why is there, I don't feel entirely pessimistic. I think, when I think about Rosalie's journey to Houston and the kind of acceptance she met there, I think that's, something to feel good about, not just conflict. You asked about remittances. I think most Americans have no idea how important they are in the developing world. I remember some legislators in Georgia wanted to tax them. I do hear people, immigration skeptics, say that they're taking money out of our economy, that it's sort of unpatriotic. Maybe that's an area somebody was asking, what good can a narrative do? I think if you see in Rosalie's story, you come to understand that she's keeping her mother alive, she's keeping her sister alive, she's educating her brothers and sisters.
Hi, my name is Valerie. I'm from the urban practice here. My question is a little bit more, it's a combination of personal and also from the bank perspective. Did you track a family for control purposes? So I think about both my parents are from the Philippines. I happen to be born in the States, but I have a natural control. Like, I think of my personal life, my mom was able to bring over her siblings and sponsor people and send money back and blah, blah, blah. And that side of the cousins in general, were educated, etc. Look at the other side of the family. None of them were able to come over. My dad was the oldest of 9. Everybody grew up in a one-room house, similar to the stories you're telling. But I'm curious, given how the economy has grown in the last 20 years, did you track any families that weren't able to get out and look at, the difference in opportunities for those? Because it did improve for some people that weren't able to leave, even some of the poorest of the poor I know in my extended family. I'm just curious.
Well, not in the way a World Bank would think of a control group, but certainly in the large extended family in Rosalie's, with 45 first cousins on her mother's side, not all of them did, and no one is doing well by staying in the Philippines. The people who stayed in the Philippines either tried to go abroad and couldn't make it, or failed overseas and came back, or are relying on somebody who is abroad. But there's not a happy story of somebody who simply stayed home and made it. I'll take that back slightly. There was one of Tita's siblings who went abroad for 5 years and didn't like it and wanted to be home and raise his kids. So he took a job coming back just to be on the farm as a poultry guy and raise his kids. But then his son became an engineer and went to Abu Dhabi. So in the end, that became a migration story too. But he had to take a big economic sacrifice, but he did it to be with his kids growing up.
One last question. Well, I would like to take my chair's privilege to ask you a question.
Is it about your sister's chapatis?
How did you like it? I have to tell you this, that we visited my village with Jason, and we were meeting my teacher, and he spoke English. So three of us spoke. I don't know if you remember that. And Jason asked him a question, something like, was Dilip a good student? And the teacher, looking at him, didn't understand a thing, looks at me, says, what did he ask? And I said in English, he asked, was Dilip a good student? He says, yeah. We were all speaking English. He didn't understand a thing. And when he said something, I think Jason asked me, what did he say? So it was both ways. I know that you have written a series of articles visiting Haitians in Dominican Republic, I'm not mistaken, right? And also Nigerians in Ireland and Nepal, and migration story in Nepal. And from all those stories, are there any new angles that occur to you that would be interesting from the viewpoint of the complexity of poverty reduction programs or other challenges or benefits? Anything that comes
Well, I think you're asking a policy question, but what I got, and so not exactly policy-wise, but what I got out of that was I had a job at the Times for about a year and a half. I got to just go around the world and write about migration in other contexts, and it was a real journey of discovery for me, because I had the sort of parochial notion that immigration was something that happened in America, but didn't have the sense that it happened in India or that it happened in Dominican Republic or Ireland. And so and I saw not only the fact that it happened, but the parallels in the situations. What I went to write about in Ireland was an equivalent of the American dreamers. They call them Irish-born children of undocumented immigrants. So there was a Nigerian kid in this, the one black kid in this otherwise white redhead class of Irish kids, and this kid's got an Irish brogue, and he watches all Irish TV and plays all Irish. And parents were illegal immigrants. The case went up to the Supreme Court, and he almost got deported. The court finally let the children stay. But you could see that see the parallels in our own situation. You mentioned the Haitians in the DR. Talk about undocumented immigrants who are just systematically abused. And if you want to appreciate the importance of birthright citizenship, go to Dominican Republic and talk to third generation Haitians whose parents were born there and they were born there and they're still not citizens. So I thought the comparative perspective was hugely important.
Thanks, Jason. Anybody on WebEx? I take that as no. So
thank you all so much for coming.
I wanted to read something before we finish. The book is very rich, and it has lots of nuances and lot of the story is not definitely linear, and there is a part where Jason talks about the fact that migration is not all about money. It can also be about finding one's calling. And it points out at Rosalie's desire to help others as a nurse. And then he has something that I think could have been an alternative title to his book. In describing their search for the sublime, Celtic pilgrims talk of thin places where the distance between heaven and earth narrows and the presence of God is more readily felt. Rosalie, the almost nun, worked in a thin place. I thought that was beautiful. Thank you.